There's a place that I used to hunt every winter, north of Stillwater Creek, a long spine of pine-covered ridge that tapers off into pretty much endless hills. The locals, they call it the back shelf. Not many go up there anymore. The trails have eroded and the old fire roads are sort of half swallowed by moss and blackberry vines now. It's the kind of place where the forest feels older than the maps really, and I hadn't been up there in years. But late last November, I decided to take a bit of a day off work, load my gear and hike in alone. Just me, the woods, and the slow patience that comes with small game hunting. I figured that I'd set up before sunrise, find a quiet spot, and just wait out the day and relax. By the time that I reached the top of the ridge, the air had that sort of glassy stillness that you only get in the deep forest. No wind, no birds, even the snow-muffled sound in a sort of strange way. My boots crunched once for every 5 steps that I took, and I remember thinking that it felt like walking across the roof of the world, quiet, suspended, and just completely empty. For most of the morning, I didn't see a soul too. But once in a while, there was a distant echo of voices, and it would drift through the trees, hikers maybe, but never close enough to see them. Then, sometime afternoon, the forest just sort of, shifted. It was subtle at first. The light dimmed even though the sky hadn't clouded, and you could feel the quiet pressing in against you. That's when I decided to move a little bit deeper, away from the old ridge trail, toward the heart of the pines. It didn't take long to find a spot, a patch of high ground ringed by tall spruce, perfect for a squirrel or maybe a hare to cross through. I settled against a tree, back straight, shotgun resting on my knees and just sort of waiting there. Time blurred a bit at that point. Every so often I would make a few soft calls and then let the silence stretch. And eventually I heard it, a faint rustling above me. I looked up and I spotted a fat grey squirrel creeping along a branch, maybe about 30 yards out. Too far for a clean shot, so I stayed still, tried another call, hoping to coax it closer. And that's when I noticed something else. There was an echo that answered, and it wasn't mine. In fact, it came from deeper in the woods. Same call and same rhythm, but just a sort of split-second delay. It was almost like it was me, but it wasn't. At first, I thought that it was another hunter, maybe trying to mess with me a little bit. I stood, waved my orange cap above the tree line, and I shouted, "I'm here, what's your fire?" But there was no reply, only that weird echo again. My last call repeated faintly, like someone whispering it from behind the trees. I laughed it off, stretched my legs, and I turned toward my pack. And that was when I heard a snap. A bullet ripped past my shoulder and smacked into the trunk behind me, sending bark flying into my face. For a half a second, I didn't even breathe. The sound had come from the east, maybe 50 yards out. My instincts kicked in, and I dove behind the log, heart slamming so hard that it was hurting. The forest went completely still again, except for the ringing in my ears, and I yelled loud, "Hey, I'm wearing orange, you idiot! You almost killed me!" My voice once again came back in fragments, bouncing between the trees. There was no answer, and nothing was moving. I waited. 1 minute, 5, 10. My hands were shaking so bad that I could barely hold my gun now. Then I caught movement. A flicker of orange, I thought at least, behind a cluster of trees. Someone shifting just out of sight. I called out again, this time calmer. "Hey, are you okay? You see where your shot went, man?" But there was nothing, just the faint crunch of snow retreating down slope, slow, measured, and definitely deliberate. I decided right then that I needed to leave. No shot was worth staying for, and I packed up and started to back down the ridge, every step feeling way too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the woods behind me stayed perfectly still. Halfway to the truck, I saw something too that made my skin crawl. There, in the snow, clear as day, were another set of footprints. They were definitely not mine too. Way too long and too wide, with a dragging sort of pattern behind them, it seemed. Like whoever made them was walking with uneven weight or something. They seemed to be, though, in the direct path that I was traveling, and then sort of veered off, circling back toward the ridge. Well, I didn't stop, and by the time that I made it back to my vehicle, I could barely breathe. I was so out of breath, but I reported it to the DNR the first thing the next morning. They took my statement, logged the location, said that they would send someone to check for illegal hunting activity, and a week later they actually called back and said that there was no sign of anyone up there. No shells, no tire tracks, nothing but old prints that were already covered by snow. I still think back about that day, and I wonder who was out there and if they were trying to kill me. It's been months since then, but sometimes I walk my dog near the woods behind my house, and I always feel a little bit nervous now. I certainly won't be going hunting alone anymore, especially in that location. And to be completely honest with you, I really just don't feel like going hunting at all, ever again. I never liked driving alone through the flatlands. There's something about those endless fields, just you, the sky, and the dark, that makes you feel like the last person alive. But that night, I didn't have a choice. My shift ended late, a storm was rolling in from the west, and the highway out of town was closed after a semi turned over on the bridge. I punched a new route into my GPS and let it guide me down a detour that I had never taken before. The rain, it came in fits and bursts, smearing the windshield no matter how high I cranked the wipers. Lightning flickered on the horizon every few seconds, revealing the looming silhouettes of wind turbines scattered across the plains. Their red warning lights, they were blinking in sync, vanishing into the low clouds like a heartbeat in the distance. I've always hated those things too. My friends tease me about it, in fact. Say it's just megalophobia, a fear of big man-made structures, but I swear that those turbines just feel wrong. They hum even when there's no wind. They move when the air is dead still. Anyway, I was about 20 minutes from my home when my stomach dropped, and it felt like someone had stepped onto the back of my neck. I couldn't explain it too. No sound, no movement, just that primal animal sense that something was about to go wrong. I slowed down on the gravel road, curved left between two dark cornfields, and then I saw something. Something long and black slipped across the road just ahead of my headlights. It didn't turn, it glided. There was no crunch of gravel and no flash of fabric, just a blur of a shape almost. Human enough to register as a person, but warped in all the wrong ways. The limbs were way too long to be human, the body way too thin, and its head moved like it wasn't connected by bone or something. I slammed on my brakes, tires skidding on the wet road. The figure, though, was gone in an instant, swallowed up by the cornfield. My headlights, they caught nothing but the thin mist rising off the fields, and for a second I genuinely thought that I must have imagined it. Until I realized that the engine had died. That silence felt like a weight pressing on me. I tried to restart the car 3 times before it sputtered back to life eventually, and I didn't even bother trying to turn around. I just kept driving, hands shaking, every blink of lightning lighting up those turbines like giant sentinels watching me leave. It was terrifying. When I got home, I was hysterical too, crying, rambling, the whole bit. My partner believed me, thankfully, my parents too, and they said that my grandparents used to talk about something that moved in those fields, out near the turbines before they were there back in the 80s. A black figure that appeared before storms, silent but fast. People called it the Hollow Man, allegedly. Farmers said that it came from the old well that was sealed when they built the wind farm. that the constant hum of the turbines had disturbed whatever had been sleeping beneath the soil. Personally, I wrote it off as just small-town superstition. Well, that was until tonight. I was inside finishing up some work while my mum and my uncle and my cousins were out front talking. They suddenly went quiet, and then I heard my mum call for me. When I stepped outside, they were pale. My uncle said that they heard someone yell woohoo, not in fear, but in some kind of an eerie, playful tone. It came from the field just past the driveway. My cousin swore the voice was close enough to be human, but the flashlight beams showed nothing but rows of swaying corn way out there in the fields. A few minutes later, the pizza delivery driver pulled in, looking like she had seen a ghost too. She said that something had run across the road just before she reached our house. Tall, black, thin as a scarecrow, but really fast. It didn't look solid, she said, like it wasn't really here almost. She was absolutely spooked, and I felt sorry for her, to be honest. But it was the exact same description. Now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it didn't just vanish that night, that instead, it followed me home. My mum says that the wind turbines attract it and that their constant motion pulls it toward the living like static on an old radio. That's her theory anyway. My uncle thinks that it's a trick of the lightning, some weird shadow effect. But here's the thing. Every time the wind kicks up now, I hear that hum again. And not from the turbines, but closer than that. It's faint, but it's like someone exhaling through the corn almost, like breathing. And sometimes when the red light blinks in the distance, I swear that one of them blinks black out of rhythm. Just once and then never again, which is a bit odd. I don't know what to think about all of this, but again, I just cannot shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It was close to 2 in the morning when the phone rang. Not a text and not a notification, an actual ring, sharp enough to yank me out of my half-sleep. My husband had already been messaging earlier saying that he was on his way home, so when I saw his name light up on the screen again, my stomach tightened a bit. When I answered, there was only the sound of rain, then faintly, his voice. "Can you hear me?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, what's wrong?" There was another pause. Then, "Something's not right. I saw I don't even know what I saw. I'm almost home. Just stay up, okay?" The line crackled and went dead. I stood by the front window watching for his headlights through the rain. When they finally appeared, crawling down the gravel drive, I felt relief wash through me. Until he stepped through the door, that is. His face was pale, wet hair plastered to his forehead, eyes unfocused like he had just woken from a nightmare that he couldn't shake. He didn't take off his jacket or shoes. He just quietly said they weren't people. It took a while to get the story out of him, but on the back road near the abandoned rail crossing, the one that connects 2 farm routes through some marshland here, he'd apparently seen some figures standing by the tracks. 3 of them, tall, thin, and pale, but not the color of skin. He said that they were paper white, like something that had never been touched by the sun before. The tallest appeared to be female. She held something glowing, though he couldn't describe what it was, just that it pulsed softly like light underwater. When his headlights hit them, though, all 3 of them turned their heads at once, and he said that just an awful dread hit him. Instinctively, too, like the way that animals freeze before lightning. He didn't stop the truck, and he just drove past without even looking back, and he said that the feeling just didn't leave him until he saw our porch light. The next morning, against my better judgment, we drove back out to that spot. The road was slick with rain, puddles collecting between the patches of gravel, and near the crossing, the ground was scorched in like a strange circle, darkened like ash had soaked into the soil. Even with the rain, it looked burnt. That's when an old blue pickup rattled up behind us. The man inside rolled down his window, grinning through a grey beard. "You folks sightseeing?" he asked. We told him that we were just looking at something strange from the night before. He seemed amused, nodded toward the crossing and said, "Oh, that old stretch? Well, you're not the first ones." Then he got out of the truck without waiting for an answer. His jeans were soaked to his knee, his boots caked in mud. "You believe in the sky folk?" he asked. I glanced at my husband. "The what?" He smiled like he'd been waiting to be asked. "They come through here sometimes, always have. Used to be that the whole field would glow blue when they passed, and my dad said that it started after the old train line shut down. Something to do with the iron and the ground current or whatever." The guy nodded his head and he motioned for us to follow him to his house up the road, a sagging old farmhouse, half swallowed by weeds. I was hesitant, but my husband, curious as always, he agreed. And the man led us to a small shed out the back, where he kept a box of faded photographs, Polaroids mostly, grainy images of the sky above the same crossing with streaks of light cutting through them. He held one close to the light bulb, swinging from the ceiling. "My father took these," he said that they weren't stars and said that they came down here, walking among us, looking for something buried allegedly. I asked him if he had ever seen the pale figures himself. His eyes flickered to the window. "Yeah, once," he said softly, "when my wife was still alive. She heard them humming before she saw them, and it was like a song that just wasn't meant for ears, I suppose." When he left, he stood in the rain and waved goodbye, his shape dissolving as our headlights swept over him. That was 2 nights ago now, and last night around the same time, 1:50 in the morning, the motion light on our porch flickered on. No car in the drive, no wind, but when I went to look, there were some wet footprints leading from the road to the bottom step, perfectly spaced, and way too long to be human. I keep telling myself that they're just old tracks, that the rain has stretched them out a bit, and that's why they're there. They're just being washed away. But every few hours at the moment, that porch light is blinking again, and it has never behaved like this before. I don't know if it's related to the past couple of nights, but it's definitely freaking me out, and I think I'm going to go and get some cameras. I've been sitting in my car for the past half an hour at least now, parked just far enough from the house that I cannot see the windows. I told my husband that I was going to refill the car with petrol, but the truth is that I just needed to breathe. I needed to be somewhere that I didn't feel watched. So this all started a few weeks after my daughter, Isla, turned 6. She'd always been a bright, lively kid, drawing, singing, building tiny forts out of couch cushions, until suddenly she just wasn't anymore. She grew quiet at bedtime, started asking to keep her lamp on at night, and began sleeping curled up at the far edge of her mattress, like she was making room for somebody else. I thought that maybe she'd picked up something at school, a scary story or a video someone had showed her. But when I asked her, she said nothing like that had happened, that she just didn't like her room anymore, that she felt like it was too crowded. That was odd because her room is small and always tidy. Nothing about it had changed really. Well, all except one thing, the wallpaper. It's been there since before we even bought the house, an old-fashioned pattern of vines and flowers, hand-painted in pale blues. I'd never really liked it, but I didn't think that it was worth replacing either. Then, Isla started pointing out little shapes in it. She said that she could see faces in the vines, if she stared long enough. I laughed it off, told her that everyone sees shapes in patterns sometimes. But a few days later, she showed me one. At first I couldn't see what she meant, until she traced it with her finger. The flowers curved in a way that looked almost deliberate, forming the outline of what looked like a tall figure, slender body, long arms, a head bent slightly forward. And the strangest part was that there were two faint dark smudges right where the eyes would be. I told myself that it must just be moisture or dust or a trick of the light or something, but Isla said he moves when the lights are off. After that, that's when she started drawing too. Every day after school, she'd sit at the kitchen table with her colored pencils and sketch her room. The same scene over and over again. The bed, the lamp, and a tall figure pressed against the wallpaper, watching her. Her drawings, they grew darker as well, more frantic. Sometimes she'd shade the corners so hard that she even tore the paper. I tried to stop her, but she got hysterical, screaming that she had to keep drawing or he'll come out all the way. We took her to see a doctor who said that it was probably just night terrors or stress or something. Suggested keeping a light on at night and reducing screen time, but it didn't help. She started waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, sobbing and shaking. I would find her standing in the hallway facing a closed door, whispering he's behind it. 2 nights ago, my husband finally agreed to sleep in her room to prove to her that there was nothing there. And he didn't even last 1 hour. He came back to our bed pale as paper, swearing that he had heard a faint scraping sound inside of the wall, slow, steady like fingernails tracing plaster. I wanted to believe that he was imagining it, but when I went in the next morning, that's when I noticed something new. There was a line, thin and jagged, running down the wallpaper from the ceiling right down to the floor. It was where the figure's arm would be in Isla's drawings. The paper, it was slit open like something had been pressing from underneath. Well, that night I refused to leave Isla alone. I sat in the chair beside her bed until she drifted off, and around midnight I must have nodded off too because I woke to her whispering my name. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the wall, and the air felt weird, damp and cold almost. I followed her gaze and saw the wallpaper suddenly move. Just slightly, but enough that I could hear it too. A slow rustling sound, like fabric stretching. The vines seemed to shift, curling in directions that they hadn't before. The face, the one that she had drawn 100 times now, was clearer now too, and its mouth looked open. I turned the light on and everything stopped. The wall looked perfectly normal again. That was last night, and this morning I packed a bag for Isla and told my husband that we would go and stay at my sister's for a few days. He argued and said that we're feeding into our fears and her fears, and while we talked, Isla was upstairs. She came down with a piece of paper clutched in her hand. It was another drawing, only this time it wasn't her room. It was the kitchen, the table, the 3 of us sitting there, and behind us, stretching across the wallpaper, was a figure, its head bent low and almost touching mine. Well, I'm not going to go back inside. I don't know what's in that house, or if it's something that she has imagined that has become real because we have fed it or whatever, but all I know is that the longer that we stay, the more it feels like the house itself is alive. I keep thinking about that split in the wallpaper too, and how it definitely wasn't there before, and I just cannot explain it. And how when I left the house this afternoon, I could have sworn that I saw the paper near the ceiling begin to bulge. I don't know what's going on, but I won't be going back, and as far as I'm concerned, we'll be selling this house soon. I don't really talk about this much anymore. Not because I've forgotten or anything, but because no one ever really believes me when I do. The memory, it comes back in flashes. The sound of an old floorboard groaning under my feet, the smell of lemon polish, and that voice, low, rough, and close enough that I felt it in my chest. When I was a kid, maybe 9 or 10, my mother used to visit an elderly woman from our old neighborhood named Mrs. Hanley. She lived alone on a big property out near the edge of town, one of those places where the drive seemed longer than it should have been, and the house looked like it had been built before the road that led to it. My mother brought her groceries every couple of weeks, and since I didn't like staying home by myself, I would always tag along. Now, the house was strange. It wasn't ruined or neglected. In fact, everything inside was spotless. Almost too spotless, like a stage set waiting for actors who never came. There was a wide staircase just past the front hall, wrapped in polished wood that gleamed in the sunlight. The steps were oddly steep too, each one a little bit higher than the last it seemed. And for reasons that I cannot explain, I felt drawn to climb them. My mother was in the kitchen chatting with Mrs. Hanley, so I figured that no one would notice if I explored a little bit. I remember getting about halfway up when I heard something. "Hey son, don't go up there." The voice came from above me, deep and gravelly, as if the man had been whispering through a sore throat. When I looked up, there was someone standing on the landing, a tall man in old suspenders and a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. He had one hand resting on the railing, the other was tucked behind him. "Too tall for you," he said. "You'll fall, and there won't be no one to catch you." Something in the way that he said it froze me on the spot. Not angry, not kind, but just sort of matter-of-fact, like he wasn't warning me but predicting what would happen. I mumbled an apology and hurried back down before my mother could notice. When I mentioned the man on the landing to her later, she said that there was nobody else in the house, that Mrs. Hanley didn't have any visitors that day. I tried to convince myself that I must have imagined it. Kids do that, right? But I could still hear the rasp of his voice in my head all the way home. Anyway, years passed and life moved on. Mrs. Hanley died while I was in college, and I hadn't thought about that house in years until her name came up at a small memorial service. Her niece, a woman that I'd never met, was talking about finally selling the property. I asked her what they were going to do with the upstairs, and she frowned. "There is no upstairs," she said. I must have looked confused because she explained that apparently the staircase had been closed off decades earlier, after her grandfather fell and allegedly broke his neck there. The steps led nowhere now, just a sealed landing and an attic crawl space. They kept it that way for sentimental reasons only, but she admitted that the whole thing gave her the creeps. She even laughed when she said, "We joke that we can still hear him pacing up there sometimes." I wanted to laugh with her, but I couldn't. I suddenly felt a little bit ill because I still remembered what that man looked like. The hat, the way he leaned on the rail, the heavy smell of dust and tobacco that hung in the air after he spoke. And I remembered the sound that came just before he appeared, the soft creak of a floorboard above me. The same sound that shouldn't have existed if the landing had been sealed. Well, last month I drove past that property for the first time in years. The new owners, they had repainted the house, fixed the porch, cleaned everything up, but as I slowed near the gate, I saw something that made me grip the wheel so hard that my fingers hurt. Through one of the upper windows, I saw movement, I swear to you. Just a shadow at first, but then, clear as day, it looked like there was a man standing there at one of the windows. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a brimmed hat tipped forward. I told myself that it had to be one of the workers or the construction guys that were there, but I kept my eyes on that window as I drove away, and the figure, it never moved. He just seemingly stayed there, watching. As I turned the corner, I remembered that day back at those stairs, and I shuddered all the way home. My brother had planned the trip months in advance, but when he came down with the flu, he asked if I wanted to use his campsite permit instead. I had been feeling burnt out. Too much city noise, too many sleepless nights, too much work, and so the idea of disappearing into the woods for a few days sounded pretty good. 2 friends came along too. Marcus, who had been camping his whole life, and David, who talked a big game but packed enough gear for a small expedition. Now, we drove north from where we were to the edge of this place that we were going to, then hiked out to a backcountry site that sat beside a nameless lake. A place so still that it almost felt staged. The air was cold enough to see your breath after dark, and by the time that the fire burned down to embers, the only sounds left were the slow sighs of water lapping the shore. It was the kind of silence that doesn't really comfort you, I guess you could say. The kind that makes your ears ring a little bit. Well, that first night was great, though I did notice something strange when I woke at around dawn to use the bush line. Across the lake, in the fog, there were several faint shapes standing near the trees. They didn't move, and they were just dark outlines like stumps or boulders, or so I thought at least. I remember thinking that it was odd how evenly spaced they were, though. And when the fog lifted about an hour later, whatever they were gone. I figured that my half-awake brain had been seeing things, but the second night started the same. Fire, cheap whiskey, laughter that echoed a little too far, and around midnight the temperature dropped pretty quickly. The fire sputtered out and we all turned in for the night. I remember zipping my tent shut and thinking just how loud that sound seemed in all this stillness. Then, at some point in the dead of the night, I woke up to something moving outside. Not an animal rustling through leaves or anything. This was slower and way heavier. There was one step, then a pause, then another step. I held my breath and listened. Whatever it was pacing along the edge of the camp now. I whispered Marcus's name. From somewhere to my right came a groggy reply, "Yeah?" The footsteps stopped. The silence was so thick that I could now hear my own pulse. Then came a new sound. 3 clicking sounds, like 3 sharp knocks spaced evenly apart, almost like somebody was tapping 2 stones together. Then there was a pause, then 3 more. It circled once around our tents, slow and deliberate, before fading toward the tree line. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn came, everything looked normal. Too normal, in fact. There was also no sign of the firewood that we'd left half stacked there that night. There were no animal tracks, and just one thing that didn't really make sense, apart from the no firewood thing. There was a set of bare footprints leading from the trees to the shore. Larger than any of our feet, wide and perfectly straight, as though whoever made them didn't bend at the ankle. One print overlapped one of my boot impressions from the night before, and whatever it was, it definitely had been standing right outside of my tent. We didn't talk much that morning. We just packed up early. Marcus joked that we'd been hearing a beaver smacking its tail, but he didn't really sound convinced either. None of us did. By the time that I got home, I had almost convinced myself that it was just exhaustion and paranoia. Almost. 2 nights later, I woke up at around 3 in the morning. The apartment was silent, but something felt wrong. Then, that's when I heard it. 3 clicking sounds. A pause, and then 3 taps, and then 3 more. It was faint, coming from outside of my window, the one that faces the alley, and I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't move. I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, listening to that same slow rhythm repeat, circling the perimeter of my building, like somebody was walking the boundary of a fence. I told myself that it must have just been the pipes contracting from the cold or something like that, metal settling, rational explanations really, but deep down, I knew that sound. It wasn't mechanical, it was deliberate, and it was what I heard that night when we were camping. The next morning, I checked the street below and there was nothing. No tracks, no stones, nothing out of place really. Well, that was 5 nights ago. Since then, the clicks have happened twice more, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. The last time too, I swear that I heard them from inside of the apartment, faint from the hallway. When I opened the door, there was nothing there, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if I'm actually hearing things. Has anyone ever experienced anything like this before, where something like this follows you home? I've stopped sleeping much and I keep the lights on all night now, even though it doesn't really help. Every night I just sort of sit awake, waiting for that sound to start again, wondering how far something can follow you before it stops being a thing of the woods anymore. And sometimes I think about the first morning by that lake, how those shapes across the fog stood perfectly still until the sun came up, how evenly spaced they were, and just how odd it seemed, how they were facing me, and I don't know. If any of you guys have any idea as to what this is or how I get rid of it, I would genuinely love your advice. This all started with a bit of a stupid idea, really. My ex and I had been driving the back roads outside of town, and we ended up pulling into a patch of public land, a mix of prairie and low forest where the city lets people hike, fish, and occasionally hunt small game too. You could see the river glinting through the tall reeds, winding slow and dark like something half asleep. A friend of his, a man maybe 20 years old, had tagged along at the last minute. He'd grown up around here, said that he used to come out to this same stretch to catch catfish as a kid. Well, we parked where the dirt lot met the grass and we set off just before dusk, following a narrow trail that snaked between the river and the tree line. For the first hour, nothing about it felt strange. The world was hushed and mild, the low whir of insects was all around us, the faint rush of water against the stones nearby, the hum of power lines somewhere far away. But the quiet was so complete that it started to feel heavy, like sound was being soaked into the ground almost. Maybe that's why we started yelling. I'm not sure, but it began as a bit of a joke. My ex, he let out his sharp, shrill whoop that echoed off the trees. I laughed and I answered back. Soon, we were both hollering nonsense into the forest, imitating the kind of war cries that you hear in old movies, trying to spook one another, I guess, but even his older friend joined in for a little while, though he cut it short after a few minutes and said that he was heading back to the car, that his knee was acting up. So we waved him off, still laughing. When he disappeared down the path, the quiet came back quickly. We roamed deeper, letting curiosity pull us away from the trail. The river kept us oriented, its black current gliding silently beside us. The trees were thin but tall, their branches twisting overhead like ribs. The sun had gone down fully now, leaving only the violet shimmer of the twilight. That was when the deer bolted across our path. Now, it came out of nowhere, a grey blur that tore through the brush and vaulted clean over a fallen tree, vanishing back into the dark with a crash of branches. We both froze. Then, clear and sharp, from somewhere behind us came a sound. It was our sound. The exact same calls that we had been doing earlier, pitched and timed in the same way even. At first, we both laughed. I mean, it had to be his friend messing with us, right? But when we shouted his name, there was no answer. We called again, louder this time, but nothing. My ex even tried ringing his phone, expecting to hear it vibrate somewhere nearby, but the forest gave back only silence. That was when I noticed that the air was strange. Colder than normal, but not like a chill breeze or anything. More like the warmth had been drawn out of the world around us suddenly. Even the river sounded quieter for some weird reason. So we decided to head back at that stage. The prairie, it opened up ahead of us, the last of the light flickering on the tall grass now. Every so often I'd glance behind, half expecting to see our friend trudging along to catch up and laughing. But there was no movement, only the shifting shadows between the reeds. Then, as we neared the bend where the river curved wide, I saw something, a shape crouched by the water's edge. It looked at first like a man sitting low to the ground, heavy set, shoulders hunched, head turned toward the current. I almost said something, but I stopped myself. It didn't seem right. The outline was blurred somehow, its edges rippling faintly as if it wasn't part of the same world that we were standing in. I told myself that I was seeing things, just the dusk playing tricks on me, and I just kept walking. A minute later, my ex stopped dead and said quietly, "Don't freak out, but I think that there's something behind us." I turned, and even before I saw anything, I knew exactly what he meant. The same dark shape that I had seen earlier was stood now, several paces back, half hidden among the grass and just sort of watching. We looked at each other, neither of us saying a word, and then we ran. We tore through the prairie until we hit a paved path lined with old wooden fences, a part of the town's bike route that led through a stretch of expensive homes. Streetlights blinked ahead of us, and for a second I thought that we were safe. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows along the fence were thicker than they should have been. We called his friend again and again, but there was no answer. Finally, though, after what felt like hours, he picked up. He sounded a bit bored, to be honest, distracted. Said that he'd been sitting in the car the whole time talking to his ex, and hadn't even moved. He even joked with us, "Did you two get lost or something?" We told him what happened. The deer, the echo, the weird figure, and his tone shifted. He said that he'd walk towards us and told us to stay on the path. When we finally saw his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, I genuinely thought that I was about to cry from relief. He looked completely normal, oblivious to what had happened. We piled into the car and we sat there for a long while with the engine running, trying to convince ourselves that we'd imagined it all. That night when we got home, I tried to play a video of the sounds that we had made and just to sort of laugh it off a bit, I guess, but when I searched for the recordings of animal calls, one of them matched almost perfectly. The description said that it came from an old story, a warning, something that mimics voices near the water, luring people off of the path apparently. I turned it off and I deleted the search history, just way too spooked to continue watching it. I haven't been back to that prairie since then, and I don't intend to go back there ever again. Years ago, I was a part of a local trail running group that liked to push boundaries a bit. During the colder months, we'd occasionally meet for night runs, cutting through forests, parks, and winding lakeside paths. The group was pretty tight-knit, 6 or 7 of us in total, but on nights like that, the woods felt way larger than our small number was, and the darkness was way thicker. This particular trail circled a lake, almost 11 miles long. It was remote, no houses, no lights, no people. Once you started the loop, there was no turning back at that point, and at least not without walking a good mile or two on uneven dirt paths. The last time that I checked, the trailhead sign even warned visitors to be prepared. Isolated area, no service. Looking back, I think that warning was way too casual. So it was late autumn, early winter, the kind of night when fallen leaves have created a thick rustling carpet on the ground. Our group set off at around 8 p.m, flashlights bobbing like fireflies as we settled into a bit of a rhythm. I was running mid-pack, keeping pace with 2 people ahead of me and 2 behind me. My own beam of light swept across the trail, illuminating orange-brown leaves and bare branches. The lake, very still at this point, was reflecting nothing but the faint starlight above. Now, out of the corner of my eye, the runners ahead of me suddenly sort of jerked sideways, almost violently in fact. My beam sort of caught them mid-movement. At first, I thought that maybe it was a snake or a stray branch, but as my flashlight swung over to the center of the trail, my stomach instantly dropped. There was an older man there, perfectly still, sitting upright as still as a statue. His body was almost indistinguishable from the leaves piled around him, and he seemed to have camouflaged himself with layers of dead foliage so effectively that we didn't even see him until we were almost on top of him. His eyes met ours, unblinking, and there was this sort of faint muttering noise coming from his lips. It sounded like gibberish at first, but gradually words began to form. Fragments, sort of disjointed sentences, I guess. A murmuring that suggested that he was reliving something maybe, some memory of pain and terror that wasn't from here. For a second, I thought that he might be hurt, maybe lost, or maybe confused. But then it dawned on me. He was alone, armed or unarmed, and we were running through the woods in the dead of the night. What was this guy doing here? The thought hit me like a jolt of ice. If he had a gun, what were the odds of any of us getting away from him in the narrow trail with really nowhere to run? The muttering, it continued, a strange cadence like he was in a trance, disconnected from reality maybe. He sort of looked disconnected from reality too. I can still hear the rhythm of that whispering in my head all these years later too. Well, we all ran, adrenaline surging through our bodies like wildfire. Leaves were exploding underfoot, branches whipped our faces, and the sound of pounding footsteps, ours or his, I'm not sure, echoed off the lake. Every part of me was screaming not to stop and not to look back, and it was only when we burst into the open section near the trailhead that I realized that I was shaking, my chest was burning, my mind was racing through every worst-case scenario, and we didn't slow down until we were safely back in the parking lot, huddled together, panting and staring at the shadows creeping toward the tree line. No one ever tried to track him down, and we never did see him again, but the image has certainly stayed with me. A man half hidden in leaves, muttering words from some distant war, just sitting there in the trail. It is still one of the weirdest and creepiest things that I have ever stumbled upon. I used to live on the edge of pretty much nowhere. A narrow gravel road, a sagging mobile home, and an endless wall of trees that started right at the back of my fence. It wasn't a bad life. I worked nights at a repair shop in town, smoked too much, and came home to the kind of quiet that most people never get to experience. That quiet, it really is what I miss most too. Before I learned, though, that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it means that something's listening, I think. So, this all started in late autumn. I went outside to smoke, the same as always. There was no moon, just the glow from my porch light spreading over the grass and dying at the edge of the woods. The crickets were loud, the frogs down by the creek even louder, and then, without warning, they all just stopped in a moment. I mean, like, every sound was just gone. Before I could even process it too, something bright bloomed between the trees. A shape, a shimmer, a presence. It wasn't like a flashlight or car beams or anything. It wasn't moving. It just sort of, well, hovered there. A perfect glowing disc, wider than my trailer and bright enough to turn the bark white and the air pale and washed out. Mind you, it didn't shine onto the woods so much as it pushed them away almost. I couldn't move. My cigarette burned down between my fingers while I stood there just staring at this thing. Then it just went out. Not faded, but just like snuffed out. And the silence that followed was worse than that light. It felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I went back inside, locked the door, and I told myself that it had to be some kind of a reflection of something. maybe a hunter's floodlight or a trick of the fog. But when I fell asleep, my dreams, they didn't agree. I dreamt that I was standing at the glass door that led to my back porch, and on the other side, just beyond the reflection of my face, sat a coyote. It didn't snarl or move, it only stared. Its eyes were flat, a human kind of brown, and it was breathing really slowly, like it was waiting for me to open the door. When I woke up, my heart was pounding. I shook it off as a bad dream until I stepped outside the next morning. The frost crunched under my boots and the world felt smaller than usual. And there it was, sitting exactly where it had been in my dream. Same height, same lean frame, same stillness. A coyote or something, maybe pretending to be one. I know that sounds crazy, but the look in its eyes was just, I don't know, way more aware than any animal that I've ever seen. Its head tilted slightly though, and its eyes sort of flickered toward the trees like it wanted me to follow. Then it trotted off, and it was as silent as a shadow. From that day on, the woods, they didn't sound the same too. Even when the crickets came back, the rhythm was a bit off. I would catch moments of that heavy quiet again, short bursts of it. And then came the last night. I remember because I couldn't sleep that night, and I was just lying in bed with my window cracked open. The air smelled wet, like rain hadn't fallen yet, but it was about to. I was just about to drift off when that silence hit again. That awful, solid kind of quiet that presses against your ears. And then I felt something. Something touched my ankle, I swear. At first I thought it was a cramp or I was imagining things, but then fingers, actual fingers wrapped around my leg. I opened my eyes, but I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could feel the weight of something on top of me, pressing down, its breath slow and ragged, its face inches from mine, though I couldn't see anything. The whole room suddenly felt bent, warped around whatever this thing was, and through it all I heard the faintest sort of clicking sound, soft and rhythmic like a tongue against teeth or something. When I finally broke free, I bolted upright, but there was nothing there. But the window was wide open, and the air outside was sort of shimmering faintly, like heat rising off asphalt. I also noticed that 3 hours had gone by in what felt like just moments. Well, I moved out 2 weeks later, told everyone that it was a money issue. Truth is, though, is that I didn't sleep another night in that place, and I just couldn't. That was 6 years ago now, and sometimes when I think back on that night, I can still feel the weight of whatever that thing was pressing down on me. I used to think that whatever appeared that night was something from above, a craft, a light, something that man couldn't understand. These days, though, I'm really not too sure about that. I think that it may have come from beneath the trees or beneath the ground, not the sky. When I look back on that year, the strangest part isn't really what happened. It's just how ordinary everything seemed. Well, right up until it wasn't. I was living in DC, working impossible hours for a congressional office, running on caffeine and deadlines, barely sleeping. My days were loud, fluorescent, structured to the second. My nights, they were quiet enough for my thoughts to begin to echo. That was when I started using dating apps. More out of habit than hope, really, but I just wanted to talk to someone who wasn't asking about policy memos or something. He called himself Cal. That's not his real name, but it's close enough to the real one, so his profile was nothing remarkable too. Clean-cut, southern, confident in a way that read as practiced. He messaged me first. His tone was polite, a little bit formal, like someone rehearsing conversations instead of sort of having them, but still, I responded. For weeks, he asked to meet too. I always told him that I couldn't. I wasn't exaggerating too. The office had me chained to my desk practically. But he was persistent in that sort of gentle, disarming way that makes no start to sound unreasonable. He would always say things like, "You deserve a break, even if it's just dinner," or "I'll wait outside your building. You won't have to even lift a finger." I should have felt the pressure then, but I told myself that he was just eager. When I finally gave in, I remember that it rained. Thin, misty drizzle that was clinging to our clothes without soaking them. He was already waiting when I arrived. I recognized him immediately too from his photo, but something was off. His eyes just didn't match his smile. They lingered too long. When he looked at me, it wasn't admiration, it was more like studying me. Dinner itself was almost dull in its normalcy. He asked questions, but they were oddly pointed, about where I lived, where I parked, if I lived alone. I kept redirecting, deflecting with practiced ease. But there was one moment that I won't forget. When I laughed at something he said, he went completely still, like a sound had startled him. Then he reached across the table and brushed a piece of my hair from my face, even though there wasn't one. I made excuses to leave at that point. He insisted on one drink next door, and I said no. He didn't react, didn't argue, just smiled and said, "You'll change your mind." I wish that I would have walked away then, but instead I followed him to the bar. He ordered for me before I spoke. Every time that I hinted that I needed to go, he acted like he hadn't heard that. When I finally pretended to take a work call, he tilted his head, almost amused, and said quietly, "You're good at lying when you're afraid." The way that he said that too, like he was complimenting me almost, but also calling my bluff. It was weird. Eventually, I did manage to get out of there. He insisted on calling me a ride, and I was too drained to argue, so I told him a false street a few blocks away from my place, and when we arrived, he followed me out of the car, but before I could react, he grabbed me by my shoulders and kissed me. Not romantic in any way too, but deliberate and forceful. When I pushed him away, he looked confused, as though I had done something strange. He let me go after that, and I literally sprinted home under the streetlights, panicking that he would follow me, but the second the door locked behind me, the silence came down hard on me. You don't realize how loud safety feels until it's gone, I guess, but I told myself that it was over. He sent messages that night, dozens of them, then the next day hundreds, some sweet, some pleading, some with a tone that sounded like the imitation of affection. I stopped responding. Well, 3 days later, a call came through to my office. Security said that a package was being screened under my name. Mind you, I hadn't ordered anything, but I didn't think too much of it. When it arrived, it was a bouquet of deep red roses tied in a black ribbon. Not the kind from a store, but wild ones. The stems were crooked and uneven, like they had been cut from somewhere by hand. There was a card, and it said only, "You shouldn't have lied about where you live." I remember sitting there, unable to breathe, staring at those words until they blurred. I never told anyone about how much that shook me, not my roommates, not my co-workers. I just threw the flowers away and I deleted the app. But, unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Over the next few months, strange things began happening that I couldn't explain. The blinds would be open when I came home, though I always kept them closed. I would find the porch light unscrewed. Once I came home to my front door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but I know that I caught a smell of his cologne. Eventually, I moved. New job, new city, new phone number, and for a long time I managed to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just a series of bad coincidences. That was, until last year when I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered and a man's voice said, "You're still good at lying when you're afraid." Then the line went dead. Now that is the part that obviously I could not rationalize any longer. I never told anyone that he had said that to me, not even once, and so I knew that it was him. I have moved, and so I believe that I'm safe, but I'd be lying if I said that I still wasn't paranoid. I often find myself checking the locks all the time, and I just cannot get the feeling out of my head that this guy is following me and that it's only a matter of time before he finds me. When I first moved into this little house at the edge of town, it was the quiet that I loved most. No traffic, no neighbors yelling through thin walls, no hum of the city bleeding through the window screens. Just space and just me. I had rented the place after a bit of a rough breakup, thinking that solitude might be good medicine. It wasn't completely isolated, mind you. A few other homes sat along the gravel road, but mine backed onto a stretch of forest that no one seemed to visit. From my bedroom window, you could see nothing but dark trees and the pale suggestion of a hill beyond them. After some time had passed, I downloaded a dating app. I told myself that it was harmless, just something to remind me that other people existed. That was how I met Elle. His profile was plain, pictures with a dog, a few lines about working in construction, and a quote about being a hopeless romantic. That kind of profile that looks intentionally ordinary, I suppose, like he didn't want to stand out. He messaged me first, and we fell into conversation pretty quickly. He had a bit of an easy charm, and after a few days he suggested meeting at a small pub near my place. I said yes, mostly because I was tired of hearing my own voice echo in the empty rooms at this stage. He was already seated when I arrived, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, 2 drinks waiting. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that is all teeth and no warmth. Still though, I sat down and gave him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, maybe he was just nervous. I remember thinking that he looked slightly different than his photos, though not enough to call it deceit by any means. Just sort of softened somehow, I guess. And well, dinner went as smoothly as any first date could, but I did notice that there was something off about him, an intensity behind his calm demeanor. When I mentioned that I'd walked to the pub, he asked for my street name, in case he ever needed to drop something by. I laughed it off and just sort of joked about never giving my address to anyone. It wasn't until I was about halfway home that I realized that I'd left my house keys on the table. I turned back, annoyed at myself, and saw him standing under a streetlight near the corner, holding something that glinted in his hand. "I was about to bring those to you," he said, holding my keys. I took them, thanked him, and watched him walk away into the dark. That night, I had a bit of a weird dream about footsteps moving across my ceiling. Not running, not pacing, but just sort of steady and careful, as if someone didn't want to be heard. I woke up to silence, though, convincing myself that it was just in my head and it was a bad dream. Days passed, and he texted a few times. I replied once or twice and then stopped. I told myself that I was just busy, but truthfully, the thought of him made my stomach twist a bit. There was something off about his messages, the tone, the timing, the strange sense that he already knew what I was doing, and then one night while I was soaking in a bath, I got a text. "Don't fall asleep in there." My phone literally slipped into the water, and I climbed out as quickly as I could. When I checked the hallway, there was no one there. The next few nights were worse too. I would wake to faint sounds, a thud, a shift, something dragging softly across wood. Things that I couldn't dismiss as just the house settling. Once I found crumbs on the counter that I know had not been there before. A glass moved to a different shelf, things of this nature. I told myself stupidly that I was being paranoid, until one night, lying in bed with the lights off, I got another message. "You move in your sleep." A second later, I heard it. There was a phone notification, but it wasn't mine, and it was buzzing faintly from somewhere inside of my room. The sound seemed to be coming from my wardrobe. Well, I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the small knife from my bedside table and bolted for the front door. As I reached the hallway, I heard it. The creak of the wardrobe door opening, slow and deliberate. Then footsteps, far heavier than my own, running after me. I made it outside and down the road, barefoot and half-dressed, screaming for help from any one of my neighbors. Eventually, someone came out and they called the police, and the police found him in my attic. He had built a small space between the beams with blankets, bottles of water and food containers, and photographs. In fact, hundreds of Polaroids. Me brushing my teeth, sleeping, sitting on the couch. Some of them were taken from impossible angles too, as though from like above through cracks in the ceiling almost. But the strangest part is that none of the photos were recent. The newest was from nearly a week before the night that I called the police. They told me that apparently he'd been living up there for way longer than 2 weeks. When I went back to the house to pack, the house, it didn't feel the same anymore. In fact, even being in there just made my skin crawl. I looked up at the ceiling and there were faint marks near the vent, like fingertips pressed into the dust, and that's when I began noticing everything. All the cracks in the ceiling that I had dismissed as just the house falling apart, various items moved where I know that they shouldn't be, and just a host of things that all made a lot of sense now. I moved out the next day, and thankfully I have not heard from him again. I don't usually talk about that night anymore. It's been over 20 years, and still, every time I try to tell the story, I always get a chill down my spine. Back then in the early 2000s, I was living just outside of Felton, working odd jobs and driving too much at night. I was young, broke, and always half awake. My girlfriend lived down in Santa Cruz, and most weekends I'd stay until it was too late, always telling myself that I'd leave after one last coffee or after one more song. You know how that is. That night, too, was no different. I left her place sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1. The streets were empty, fog curling low across the lights near Ocean Street, and I remember how the air smelled, wet asphalt and a bit of ozone. I turned onto Graham Hill Road, heading home, the kind of stretch that you could drive half asleep because you've memorized every bend. And that's when I saw the truck. It was a few hundred feet ahead of me, taillights hazy through the mist, and we were both taking the incline toward the cemetery, that part where the trees close in tight on both sides and the shoulder sort of disappears. The truck, it drifted slightly left, almost into the center lane, and I remember muttering something under my breath about drunk drivers, and then it swerved again, sharper this time, its tires screeching against the asphalt. I tapped my brakes instinctively, and that was when I saw it. I still don't know what to call what it is that I saw, but it was something crouched low beside the road, right where the pavement met the grass. It wasn't moving at first, just sort of there, a pale shape bent awkwardly, facing away from me. My first thought was that it was a person, and maybe they were hurt, maybe a crash victim or something. But then it started to straighten. I slowed as my headlights swept over it. It was small, maybe 5 foot tall if standing straight, wearing what looked like a thin, light-colored dress. Its hair hung down long and wet-looking, sticking to its shoulders. But the worst part wasn't how it looked, but how it moved. This thing didn't stand. It unfolded its joints, creaking out of sequence, like it had forgotten how to be human. When its head lifted, I saw its face for the first time, and it tilted way too far upward, mouth stretched open, but no sound coming out, just silence. And then, as if I caught its attention, it turned toward me. I remember the beam of my headlights passing by its face. Its eyes, if that's what they were, didn't catch any glare too. They seemed like they were just dark pits, holes where light should have been. I swerved, my heart jumped into my throat, and for a second I thought that I hit it. I even felt the steering wheel shudder like something brushed against the side of the car. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, the road was now empty. The truck ahead of me was speeding now, well over the limit, its taillights disappearing around the curve. I wanted to catch up, to be honest, just to know that somebody else had seen it too, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. By the time that I reached the turnoff near Felton, my knuckles were white on the wheel, and I parked outside of my house and sat there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to steady my breathing. Eventually, I went inside, and I tried telling myself that it must have just been a trick of the fog, or maybe someone or something wandering the roadside. But I just couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, or how they seemed to track me even after I'd passed. That would have been the end of it too, but about a week later, something strange happened. I was leaving for work early one morning, just before sunrise. The fog was back, thicker than before, and I went and got into my car when I noticed something on the windshield. Faint smears like fingerprints, but they were too high, pressed near the roofline. Someone would have had to have stood on the hood to leave them there. A few nights later, too, I dreamt that I was back on Graham Hill Road. The fog was so thick that I could barely see, and somewhere ahead of me I could hear the low whine of an engine idling, and I followed it until I reached a bend where a figure was kneeling in the middle of the lane. When it looked up, I woke up screaming, and for a while after that, I just avoided that route entirely because the whole thing was just getting to me. I took the long way home for a bit, even though it added half an hour to my drive, and I didn't tell anyone why. I mean, who the heck would believe me, right? Well, years passed and I moved and met someone new, started a family, but every now and then I'd hear stories, locals talking about a woman seen walking the road near the cemetery, sometimes kneeling at the shoulder, sometimes appearing in the middle of the street, and people said that she was the White Woman, some old ghost legend from like the 1960s, but what I saw wasn't a woman. It wasn't anything human, that much was clear. Last winter, I had to drive that way again as well, and I thought that I was ready. The road hadn't changed much, same trees, same sharp turns, and as I approached the stretch near the cemetery, the radio in my car started to hiss, just static, and